Thank you for coming today. Turns out to be nice weather, so we had competition, and therefore seeing you is an especial pleasure. The timing of this series is fortuitous at the period when I was considering what topic to pick up. There was already widespread discussion of sanctuary, but at that time I could have had no idea that President Trump would choose this very week to announce that he was going to cancel the executive order deferred action for childhood arrivals. So the issue of sanctuary has become immediately pertinent, and I will be arguing during the course of our meetings together that sanctuary is also pertinent across a variety of issues. Immigration is simply one of them, but it doesn't account for the full potency of this concept. In order for sanctuary to be applied at all, however, it needs to be understood. And that, I think, at the moment is a major problem which I am here seeking to address. I can, I think, best illustrate the problem by explaining some reaction I have heard to the very discussion of sanctuary since Inauguration Day. One form of the reaction has been, surely every priest and every pastor knows what the practice of sanctuary is. You go to seminary, don't you? I have to break the news. There is no seminary in this country or in any country that instructs you where to find the handcuffs when a customs agent comes to your church. It is not, sanctuary is not an active part of pastoral practice today. It is simply unrealistic to anticipate that a local leader of any religion will have an instant response to how to construct sanctuary within our period. And the other very common response is any discussion of sanctuary is nonsense, because there can be no situation in which a religious community can claim the power to put a constraint on the authority of government. I want to suggest that both of those positions, although inaccurate and not viable, also do contain within them a certain wisdom about the concept of sanctuary. The first, because at some level, sanctuary is very deeply embedded. And I'm going to be pointing out from today, it's embedded not only in medieval Christianity, where most people imagine the idea emerges. It's embedded in the practice of religion literally from the time of the Neolithic period. And therefore, it belongs in one way or another to the unfolding of every single religious tradition of which we are aware. So naturally, leaders of all kinds of denominations and religions ought to be aware of the background of the force that they're dealing with. And then on the other hand, the other response has its own wisdom, because since the 16th century, modern states have, in fact, formally outlawed the practice of sanctuary. It was once, especially during the Middle Ages, very widely prevalent, and statute law brought it to an end in most forms. However, because there are forms in which sanctuary has survived, it's been possible for it sporadically to make a comeback. During his introduction Father Cartier pointed out correctly that the term was used during the war in Vietnam and actually applied. But it was in the nature of the 60s that, one might say, analysis never got in the way of enthusiasm. After all, this was also the period during which readers of the East Village Other, of which I was one, were invited to a demonstration in Washington which was called Exorcise the Pentagon. There was a willingness to plumb a variety of religious language in order to construct a rhetoric of resistance, and it was more or less effective according to one's judgment, but in any case, it was not systematic in the concepts which were being applied. And I'll be suggesting that in our time, because of the nature of the threats to human liberty that sanctuary is designed to answer, one needs to be more systematic, and one needs also to be historical in understanding how it is that sanctuary evolved and how, therefore, it might be utilized afresh in our own situations. Whether we do so from the point of view of those who wish to take part in sanctuary action, or those simply who wish to understand what's going on. Sanctuary is like many, many other theological ideas. They may be analyzed, they may be practiced, or you could do both. You also have the option of remaining completely ignorant of them, and that's fine, but then if you happen to be ambushed by one, don't come to me. So you see, the title of our first discussion, I've made the origins of sanctuary in sacred sites. That is, sacred sites in the deepest antiquity that we can imagine. And I begin with a quotation on the first side of the handout from Jean-Pierre Vernon. He is here speaking in an article, but it's based on a work that he wrote with another anthropologist named Marcel Détienne, called, this is one of my favorite titles of all time, The Cuisine of Sacrifice. Don't you wish you had thought up that title? In it he writes, by sacrificing, mankind bows before the will of Zeus, who created mortal and immortal beings as two distinct races. Communication with divinity takes place during the ceremonial meal, a reminder that dining with the gods is over. Men and gods are now separated. No longer do they live together, nor eat at the same table. And the underlying conception, which is here being developed, is that there is a relationship between meals that a community regularly practices for ordinary nourishment and sociability, and meals in the presence of the divine, which is precisely the definition of sacrifice. That is why whenever you deal with a sacrificial community, you will see that the particular rules that govern how sacrifice is to be offered also have an immediate influence on the way in which food is prepared for household use. That is, for example, the origin of the Judaic laws of kashrut. At the very beginning, there is the sacrifice. That then influences the practice of ordinary meals. Because within the action of sacrificing, it's understood that the divinity takes part in the action and takes pleasure in what is going on. The notion of that pleasure that the divine can take in sacrifice comes to voice within the next quotation that you see, which is from the Epic of Gilgamesh. This will immediately remind you of a certain passage from the Hebrew Bible that I will not even mention. because it will strike you so forcibly. You might well ask yourself, which came first? Well, the Epic of Gilgamesh began to be written in 2100 before the Common Era. About 1,000 years before there is any Hebrew oral tradition of which we are aware. That's one reason one uses such texts in association with anthropological work in order to understand how can we conceive of sacrifice prior to the emergence of distinct religions. What do people believe is going on within their activity? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh meets a wise survivor of an event he'll refer to, named Utnapishtim, whose survival has meant that Utnapishtim has acquired immortality. And he speaks of how it is that after a cataclysmic flood, for which he prepared a craft, he was able to offer a sacrifice from the animals he had gathered in his craft. And he says, "So, I set all free to the four winds of heaven, and I poured a libation, and scattered a food offering on the height of the mountain. 7 and 7 did I lay the vessels, heaped into their incense basins sweet cane, cedar wood, and myrtle. And the gods smelled the savor. The gods smelled the sweet savor. The gods gathered like flies about the priest of the offering." You may recall that in the story of Noah, God comes to the conclusion, I'm not going to make a flood again, after he has smelled the sacrifice. And it is described as a riach nokoach, a pleasing aroma. The conception is that divinity enjoying this particular kind of provision for sacrifice also gives blessing to those who are taking part in it. And the place where that happens, in this case, Utnapishtim's sacrifice, is understood at that moment as being the very center of the world. That is why it is from there, Utnapishtim says, that he can free things to the four winds of heaven, the 4 points of the compass. When you decide that the place where this sacrifice takes place is going to be a stable spot on the earth, that spot becomes for the practitioners of the sacrifice the very center of the world. And it is very likely that they will develop stories of creation in which it is said that this is the place from which God or the gods began their work. The place where sanctuary happens, where sacrifice takes place, is understood to be the sanctuary for the God, as well as for the participants who are making sacrifice happen. In its most ancient form, sanctuary is the central location of sacrifice. And it's because of its identification with sacrifice that sanctuary then can be used for the conception that it offers a special kind of protection under circumstances which we'll come to in just a moment. But first I want to reflect on the way in which this conception of sanctuary as the very center of the earth developed spontaneously, as far as we can see, during the Neolithic period, We're talking about the period between around 15,000 before the Common Era and around 8,000 before the Common Era. The most ancient cities, places such as Jericho, represent the earliest form that we know of this new Neolithic invention, the city, which comes into existence because of the development of agriculture. The possibility in that development in domesticating grain and animals of having a certain amount of surplus production to ordinary requirements, provided there is cooperation, provided that there is a certain amount of specialization of activity. How was that achieved? I next come to a statement from a fine scholar whose name is Paul Wheatley. I'll be quoting from a work of his where he began, it's called The Pivot of the Four Quarters. It was published in 1971. And you see in that title, Pivot of the Four Quarters, he's developing this very theme, that the city is understood to be the pivot of the universe as a whole. And so he says, whenever, in all the 7 regions of primary urban generation, that is, wherever cities first emerge, and by this he means North China, his fundamental interest, but also Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, Mesoamerica, the Andes, and also Yoruba territory in present-day Nigeria. Wherever you see these cities emerge in the Neolithic circumstance, he says, we trace back the characteristic urban form to its beginnings. We arrive not at a settlement that is dominated by commercial relations, a primordial market, or one that is focused on a citadel, an archetypal fortress, but rather a ceremonial complex. That is, it appears to be the case that the social action of sacrifice was the catalyst for the kind of organization necessary to bring about the Neolithic city. Once it existed, its institutions grew explosively. In order to have a temple, you need a priesthood, defined not as religious experts, but rather as masters of slaughtering animals. You also have to have a means of protection for your temple. That means you need walls, you need builders. It also means you need a king, it is thought, to protect you. A king also, ideally, to extend the arable land under your jurisdiction, and at the very least to defend what you have. Ancient cities were in a perpetual state of warfare, either extending or defending land. They therefore had to believe that their king was going to win, that their king had a special relationship to the god of that city, that their king was in fact the son of the god, which they begin calling him. Exactly during this period, we can now see from Canaanite texts, that is, texts from the land that was later called Israel, but before then was occupied by Canaanite cities, whose tablets, written in stone, have now been deciphered. With all of those new institutions, there also comes the possibility of commercial expansion. Because if you're going to have a central temple for sacrifice, that temple demands that you have standards of weight and measure, accounts. We have to write. We have to produce scribes. That's why the growth of the city was as explosive as it was. And with that explosion, there also came the issue How is it that we balance our understanding that the sanctuary where sacrifice takes place is paramount with the powers of the community, which at this stage are also growing, because wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together, there is statute law. And if you're in America, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together, one is suing another. How is it that we take the conception of law as it develops and we balance that against the notion of the sanctuary being at the very center of our community? That's how we get to the moment where sanctuary, in the sense of offering protection, is born. It is, as it were, a next step. Sanctuary as sacrificial location, that's a primordial concept prior to the Stone Age. As far as I can see, sacrifice in that sense was practiced by Neanderthal. If you look at their sites, one can see them set up in such a way that the conceptions I've referred to are reflected. But it is within the city that you get the notion that the place of sacrifice, the sanctuary, may also be a place of protection for certain people. And we see this development emerge clearly in the book of Exodus, and then it's going in the book of Numbers to be spelt out much more clearly. And once we get to that moment, we're into the historical period proper, which I can begin to refer to when we meet next week. But before that, just to arrive at this notion that sanctuary translates into protection. And so in Exodus, this is the Torah, the law that Moses is instructed to give Israel. He that strikes a man so he dies shall surely be put to death. This is within the same section, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, burn for burn. It's right within that section. The basic conception of retaliation for wrongdoing. But if a man does not lie in wait, in other words, if I have not intended to kill a person, I've not been hiding behind an obstacle, waiting to attack him with a weapon or with my hands. If a man does not lie in wait, but God made him fall into his hand, what does that mean? God made him fall into his hand. That means that in the course of dispute, things got very rough, and it turned out that one man killed another. In the course of a physical dispute, where there had not been the intention to murder from the very beginning. What then? Because this is not standard murder. We would say there is an absence of intent. And if there is no intent, that makes the act of a different kind from what it would be if there were intent. Then I will appoint for you a place where he will flee. And if a man acts willfully against his neighbor to kill him with cunning, you will take him from my altar, so he will die. It's only when we get to that next clause we understand what's going on. The flight, if it takes place, is to happen to the altar. The altar, the place of sacrifice, offers protection to this man who is killed but has not murdered. However, if the fact is it was an intentional act, then he is to be removed from that altar and he's to be put to death. Now that opens up a whole series of questions. Wait a minute, who takes him from the altar? who decides about intentionality, and who finally dispatches this guy if in fact he did commit murder. As is often the case, the book of Numbers adds to what we have in the book of Exodus. Many of the laws in the book of Exodus, coming from the oldest collection there is of Israelite law, are of a schematic nature, set out principles without reference to case law. The book of Numbers, on the other hand, is a priestly source. Priests had direct experience of trying to implement this kind of sanctuary practice, and so we do get much more detail in the book of Numbers. I have just, by happenstance, decided to stop at verse 13. If you get interested in this from the book of Numbers, you can go on in chapter 35 and see many other precise indications of how sanctuary is to be implemented. I mean, one basic question is, well, where are you to flee exactly? You say the altar. Well, which altar? Numbers, as you see, actually spells that out. You shall select for yourselves cities. They will be cities of refuge for you. And this is the language used in the book of Numbers for what we now would call sanctuary cities. They are cities of refuge in this sense. The slayer will flee there who strikes a person, and I love this, by mistake. This is the Hebrew term chagiga. It's applied in other circumstances, especially in priestly sources. For example, there is in the book of Leviticus a provision for what happens if someone steals from someone else chagiga by mistake. I think this is so wonderful. I am just delighted that my sons did not know this word when they were growing up. Otherwise, it just would have added another level of excuse to what they already had in their vast arsenal. Chagiga, really? I stole from you? Well, in that case, I killed him? I didn't mean it. Well, that must have made for very interesting case law in a whole variety of circumstances, and it does represent the root of our conception of criminal intent. And bear in mind that the issue of intent is an important one in all forms of adjudication in Western law, largely for this reason. The slayer will flee there who strikes a person by mistake. And the cities, this to me is just a wonderful expression. And the cities shall be a refuge for you from an avenger. So the slayer will not die until he stands before the assembly for judgment. They're refuge for the community. Why? Because in Israelite law at this time, if you kill, let's say, a member of my family, it would become my responsibility as what was called the goel to avenge that death. I would track down the person responsible for the murder and kill him. And that was a form of legitimate action. It wasn't even a crime to be excused. The conception was the family's honor had been damaged, that honor had to be redeemed. And therefore the goel had to act as an avenger. As a matter of fact, the term goel refers both to an avenger who kills someone who has murdered a member of the family and of someone who is a redeemer. The same word, goel, redeemer and avenger. That gives you a sense of what a powerful concept this was. But in a city environment, that'll tear up your community very, very quickly. If you authorize that kind of personal vigilantism, there will never be an end of the kind of grudges, one family to another, that can be avenged by death. And so in the conception of this text, these cities of refuge are not only for the person fleeing, they also give refuge to the community, which then has a way of adjudicating the dispute. Because then, it goes on, the cities that you shall give will be 6 cities of refuge, 3 cities beyond the Jordan on the east side you shall give, and 3 cities you shall give in the land of Canaan. Notice, by the way, that they still understand in this period that the land is Canaan before it was Israel. 3 cities in the land of Canaan. They shall be cities of refuge for the sons of Israel, for the sojourner, that is, for the person who is in Israel, but in fact not an Israelite, and is simply passing through, and the resident. Resident means resident alien. For sons of Israel, the sojourner, the resident among them, these cities shall be a refuge for all who strike a person by mistake to flee there. And then the conception is that the assembly makes the judgment, was there a tent or not? And then, if that is the case, they hand the victim over to the Goel, to the avenger, and he is put to death. So we are still dealing with very primitive institutions, but we see reflected in these ancient texts 2 realities about sanctuary that remain a part of the concept as it unfolds further. First, that it is rooted in the action of sacrifice, which is understood to be a privileged activity because it brings humanity together exceptionally with the divine. And second, that sanctuary can be understood as being protective because by placing people there who might be innocent, you accord them the possibility of adjudication instead of revenge. The sanctuary in that sense can stand between a person and the application of ordinary law. That's the very essence of sanctuary as it unfolds over the centuries that follow. Of course, this will raise certain questions for us. Namely, how does this conception, rooted in the action of sacrifice, ever get passed on to Christianity, where you might have noticed there is no sacrifice? And in fact, many religions which are post-sacrificial, which do not require animal sacrifice, and in fact think it's a bad idea, many religions which are post-sacrificial nonetheless have within them a conception of sanctuary. That is exactly what we have to see next week. Thank you very much for joining with us. Yes, please.
So the idea of sanctuary and refuge does not preclude the idea of the judgment and trial. So even though they are free from, say, the law and court, but they're not free from being guilty and killed if choice within sanctuary means something like that. So I think how thinking about Julian and Psalm is funny. The idea of sanctuary and refuge is implicit in that some kind of sense of security. In other words, you're not safe.
Yeah, this is a very important observation. I'll just repeat a little bit for the sake of the Cardinal of Red Hook, so his tape is in good order. First of all, in the text from Numbers, the sanctuary which is offered in the sense of protection is not absolute. That is, if you show up in the city and you are guilty of murder with intent, being in the city of refuge, taking the protection of the altar there, will only offer you a reprieve. Because ultimately, there is, alongside the sanctuary, also a system for adjudicating, is it appropriate to offer sanctuary to this person? And that is usually a part of sanctuary practices, and appears to me to be only reasonable from a practical point of view. That is, any person could say, someone is after me because I killed Chagiga. And maybe that's not true. In order to offer the sanctuary, some method of assessment is within the Book of Numbers, implicit in the whole practice. You don't see that assessment reflected in Exodus because, as I said, that's a more schematic statement. But then on to your second observation, the comparison with, let's say, Julian Assange taking refuge in a consulate, on the thought that the consulate is foreign territory within the United Kingdom at that time, which implies that accepting that sanctuary also constrains movement, since if he goes out to the local pub, that'll be his last joint out to that pub. It is implicit in sanctuary that insofar as you are under adjudication, you are in effect a prisoner of that location. That location is giving you a certain freedom, but because the location is highly circumscribed, and the notion is you have to be, you see this in Exodus, and next week we're going to come to abuses of Israelite kings of sanctuary practice. And what we're going to see there is that those who sought refuge from kings, this is not only an avenger of blood, a Goel, this is a king. What do you do when he's after you? And the answer is, you not only go to the city, you go to the temple, you go to the altar. And altars were so set up in Israelite practice that altars at the corners had horns. They were set up as if the altar itself was mimicking the beasts offered on the altar. And victims are described as clutching the horns of the altar and being dragged off. So there, quite clearly, there's an element of physical constraint just implicit in being restricted to that area. But then, as I say, we'll find places where this carefully promulgated sanctuary law is simply abrogated by people who don't believe they have to observe it and who don't see anyone to force them to observation. Wonderful ideas. Yes, please. This is, I think, a very helpful distinction that you're making, posing the question, we see these particular regulations about sanctuary in Exodus and Numbers to deal with what you might call aggressive acts. Whether or not they're criminal acts, they're aggressive acts, and therefore sanctuary may be provided to someone who has been an aggressor, but who did not intend to commit the crime of murder, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, those who have perhaps committed no crime, but who might nonetheless be a victim of prejudice, of violence, of oppression. Within the Israelite conception, there is a distinction between special cases and ordinary justice. Ordinary justice specifically applies, as Zechariah puts it, to almano v'yatum ger v'ani, to the orphan, to the widow, to the sojourner, to the foreigner. Ordinary justice means you provide support, you provide housing, you provide protection as is necessary. I had not reflected on it before your question, but Israelite law doesn't even imagine the possibility that being a foreigner would be a crime. You notice that even within the provisions for the city of refuge in Numbers, it's not only for the sons of Israel. It's also for the sojourner and the resident, meaning the resident who's not an Israelite. This is a moment where it's simply taking an occasion to say that the refuge really is a city of refuge for you. It's protecting you from vengeance. And therefore, it has to apply to everyone. But if it were the case that one of these subgroups of non-Israelites were also in some way oppressed, then it would be a demand not of sanctuary but of ordinary justice that they would have to be provided for. So I think in our time we are living through the interesting and distressing condition that classes of society which are in biblical literature privileged, that is, if you're an orphan, a widow, a sojourner, an alien, the community, according to prophetic teaching as a whole, has a particular duty to protect you, because it's understood that they may well be the victims of public oppression. And therefore, any kind of well-regulated community would act against that. That biblical preference for, let's just call it the resident alien for the moment, is, as we speak, being reversed in the United States, and I have to say in other countries. I mean, one reason that the Brexit was passed in the United Kingdom was that there was the feeling, isn't it time to expel people who aren't British from the United Kingdom? There is not a moment, let's face it, the Hebrew Bible is not a gentle document. Right? We have avengers of blood. We have justifications of rape. We have the decimation of entire communities. It's pretty difficult reading. But at no moment does this obviously primitive document say, I have an idea, let's throw out all the aliens. What makes modern society capable of conceiving an action which this obviously very primitive community would not even contemplate. So as I say, many groups that today we see as requiring special protection as a result of public policy were understood in the ancient world as people who, just as a matter of justice, should be dealt with on a regular basis. That leads to a modern possibility of applying the sanctuary concept much more widely. In this sense, we have become worse. That is exactly the case. This is one example. Sadly, it's not the only one. This is just one example of the way in which we have become more cruel as compared to ancient societies. And what is, to my mind, most tragic is that we do so without an apparent awareness of our cruelty. You know, when as a candidate, President Trump could say, "Oh, the judge is not qualified to judge me because he's a Mexican." He was an American, of course, but of partially Mexican descent. When he said that, there's no awareness that this is not a statement which computes in the ethical language of the prophetic tradition. And yet somehow he is approved by evangelical opinion. We are living in a very interesting time, a distressing time, but one reason for the distress is we have many people, leaders of different communities, religious and not, who act without any reflection whatever of the historical roots of their own conceptions. And that's why I think a consideration of sanctuary is something that makes one more powerful in acting ethically, not only assessing what is going on at the moment, but in understanding what can be done in order to alleviate injustice. One of the things that can be done, I do think, is very well, if you won't accept that the alien is deserving of ordinary justice, then let's bring on sanctuary. It becomes, as it were, a fallback position, but one that could be powerful if we can find a way to make sanctuary function within our setting. And that's why I'm moving up towards the modern period. Yes, please. Thank you very much. I count 2.5 questions. And very good questions indeed. The first one frequently comes up. That isn't human sacrifice the origin of sacrifice generally? It has to be admitted that human sacrifice was practiced in the ancient world, and indeed it was practiced in the vicinity of Israel, the reason for which there's the story of Abraham and Isaac is because Abraham is acting according to an ancient Near Eastern impulse. If what you offer in sacrifice is the most valuable possession you can imagine, why not your son? Why not your daughter? There's the story of Jephthah, the judge. who goes through it, sacrifices his daughter. There are also references to kings of Israel who sacrificed their sons, as well as ancient historians such as Strabo, who describe massive numbers of child sacrifice in North Africa. For many years it was thought Strabo surely was exaggerating. Archaeology found the skeletons. Aztec sacrifice famously included a human component. However, because human sacrifice was widespread, doesn't mean that it was the origin of the practice. And this, in fact, represents a major decades-long dispute I had with a French literary critic and anthropologist named René Girard. Girard argued that at the beginning of all sacrifice, there's human sacrifice. And I was able to argue and to convince most people that archaeologically and historically speaking, human sacrifice takes place under moments of extreme aberration. Highly militaristic cities, when they're not only at war, but understand themselves to be at the point of extinction, represent the action of sending out their sons to die by offering the king's son in sacrifice. And whenever you see the whole issue of human sacrifice emerge, in Greek sources, in Latin, in Aramaic, in Egyptian, that appears to be the situation. Namely, it is an act within the sacrificial paradigm which actually breaks the underlying understanding of what a sacrifice is. If it's inconceivable to you to eat your child, you wouldn't sacrifice your child. Just as if it's inconceivable for you to have at the table, you would not offer it on the altar. I think that probably means that I'll pursue your question in private. We can also pick up further questions next week. And as I say, it'll be our function at that time to see how it is that Christianity, which has no visible animal sacrifice, nonetheless winds up having a very vigorous sanctuary understanding. Thanks very much.